Okay, you done? All right, here we go. Hi, I'm Ralph Baker, and I'm an expert on a so-called expert on all things Donald Trump, and this is Trump and the GE. We started this event a couple years ago to discuss the president's policy and how they affect the community and the economy. Tonight we're going to discuss Samaria Rice, the mother of Torian Rice, who called out high-profile activists for, I guess, what she called the grift. And that's something that's been rampant, I think, over the past decades, almost risen along with a lot of the social unrest and a lot of the high-profile police misconduct cases, whether it's Trayvon Martin or Michael Brown or Tamir Rice. So tonight we're going to discuss, obviously, the economy and, you know, uh, Samaria Rice's comments. You kind of hear the pain of a mother. I think we all understand what that what that sounds like, the pain of a grieving mother. We're going to discuss her comments and sort of what does it mean for the economy and particularly for social unrest. I think we're going to see more of that. The more social unrest you see, the more you're going to see Black Lives Matter and DeRay McKesson and she called out. So tonight we have with us Torian Mitchell. I'll let him introduce himself and give us sort of a brief overview of the economy.
Uh, yeah, I'm Torian Mitchell, as I am every week. Just my overall view. Well, I guess before giving my overall view, I'm a COO of a burgeoning education technology platform,
Can
ACE
you tell us the
Network,
name?
which
Okay. All right.
yep, ACE, and that's spelled AYCE, ACE Network, which provides strategic financial guidance for the SME market. Along with that, I also I'm a wealth manager as well, and would like to think that I have somewhat of a handle on the ebb and flow of the economy, both from a kind of topical, 30,000-foot view, as well as a more realistic day-to-day view on our material conditions um, and that's really where, for me, I put most of my lens, and which really guides my perspectives, along with my political leanings. Um, and for me, although we've had over the decades some silos of progress and success as a community, and specifically Black community, we have largely, in my opinion, we're regressing. And the metrics that I use to determine that regression is ownership levels, home ownership. In fact, the Atlantic did a profound story a few years ago. I believe it was 2016. They looked back 100 years from that point, from 1916. During that time, we were entering the Industrial Revolution. This is arguably post Reconstruction era, but still within Reconstruction era, and certainly post emancipation, post slavery, and looked at the home ownership levels within the Black community at the time, and adjusted for the lower the lower population size. So doing it on a per capita basis, to see that our home ownership levels have actually decreased. At the time, we owned about a little over 1.5% of land within this country. Fast forward 100 years from 2016, and that dropped to less than 1%. So to me, that indicates a significant regression. Where that regression comes from, I think it's not just a singular thing. It is essentially amalgamation of all of the things post Reconstruction, which we've heard. I think that drum beat quite frequently within the last 6 to 7 years, more so even the last 2 to 3 years leading up to this most recent election. when we talk about racial wealth gap, and specifically talking about ownership levels, employment levels, education levels, as a result of essentially racial policy, such as redlining, such as even the New Deal, which although Black people and actually specifically both Black women were able to benefit from government jobs. In fact, government was the greatest employer of Black communities since World War II, and continues to be so. However, even with the significant influx within government jobs, we were still largely barred from participation within the policies of the New Deal, and certainly had a profound impact when it came to FHA loans. Not being able to participate in those loans, not being able to participate in some banks, not being able to participate within investment products that allow the rest of the country, regardless of socioeconomic status, or whether you were a poor white farmer, you could simply move into a different class, obviously with some effort and work, etc. But you had the possibility to move in a different class, whereas Black people never had an opportunity to move out of a racial class. So while economically the opportunities may seem to be present, they were not present in practicality. And that's the difference. So while the opportunities on the surface were there, we fast forward 100 years and we see the result of the fact that we were not able to participate in socioeconomic policies that were supposed to be for everyone, which has resulted in lower home ownership rates, which results in the persistent financial exploitation. We can see that exploitation. Ally Bank, for example, along Wells Fargo, was sued I believe 2015, sometime between 2015, 2017, for financial discrimination, for issuing loans, auto loans to Black borrowers with higher credit ratings than their white counterparts, and Ally still gave them higher interest rates and unfavorable terms. And this is, 100 years past Jim Crow. So the point being is that while on a government level or a legislative level, these policies may exist, but in the practitioner of those policies, we have still been largely discriminated against, exploited, continue to be exploited, which we're living and seeing the results because our material conditions have not changed. So to me, that is more reflective when we talk about economy. What is the state of the economy? What we're really asking is, what is the state of the material conditions of the constituency, material conditions of our community? It's expected that without some drastic change, continue on the same path. We're expected to have a median net worth of zero. The average Black family to have a median net worth of zero by the year 2050. Or we're already in year 2021. I'm certainly older than 20 years. My brother here, Ralph, is older than 20 years. So in other words, we've lived past the time period that it'll take to get to 2050. So while it may seem like a far off from 2021, we are living proof that 20 years goes by pretty quickly. And, so in other words, that is the reality of where we are as an economy. We are stagnant in our wages. We're still fighting for a fight for 15, but let's make it very clear that a fight for 15 is still not a fight for a livable wage. $15 an hour is not a livable wage. I want to say between Market Watch and Business Insider, they probably publish an article every month which indicates places that the cost of living is higher or lower than the minimum wage can afford. And out of the 48 contiguous states, often there's only one or two places since both Market Watch and Business Insider have been doing these reports over the last 4 years where you can find a livable place on a single wage, and that single wage be minimum wage. So even a fight for 15 is still not a fight for a livable wage. That's the state of our economy. If folks cannot afford to put a roof over their head, food in their bellies, they cannot afford the health care when they need it, they can't afford the car note to get them to the job, if they are essentially sacrificing for a job that can't even pay them a livable wage, well, then that is a cycle for disaster. And to me, that is the reality of our economy and the way that I see it and where we are. So that's my 30,000 foot
Right.
in the economy.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. Exchange, which I wrote a while ago, predicted a lot of this was going to happen because I think the government's reaction to the Great Recession was to print money and give it to the investor class, give the spiel that rising tides lift all boats, and I was pulling my hair out at the time. I basically predicted that it was wrong-headed policy and that eventually the economy would slow, but you have a bunch of people who have been made wealthy from money gifted to them from the government, and that's where we are. And even my family thought I was off my rocker. They like the fact that I wrote a book, but I was probably saying things that nobody was saying back then. And my high school English teacher helped me edit the book, and I went to college in my hometown. She asked me, at Hampton Sydney College, she asked me, "So who's your economics professor?" And I had to swallow hard because she was wondering, what is this guy talking about? We're headed for another recession. Because at the time it was the general theory was that, the economy is great. See, so all the vital statistics were going up because we're printing money. Stock market's going up and unemployment's going down, but there were other things going on, such as long-term unemployment. The labor participation rate was low as it had been since the Carter administration. We know what happened during Carter's administration. There was stagflation. You had high unemployment. You had costs going up for oil because OPEC was raising the oil prices.
Long gas lines.
Carter administration, I think of Iran. Yeah, exactly. When Jimmy Carter asked us to pitch in. It was weird back. It's different now. I don't think it was as partisan back then as it is now. I don't think, but the president asked us to pitch in and to get gas on. If you had your license plate had an odd number, you could get gas on this day. If your license plate had an even number, you can get gas on the next day. And I remember long gas lines out in California. It's the craziest thing you ever seen. But the president asked us to do it, so we pitched in. But people think about the Iran hostage situation when they think of Jimmy Carter, but they also don't remember that there's an economic quagmire under him. So the labor participation rate for much of the Obama years, and part of Trump years, hasn't been that low since the Carter administration. But a lot of this is kind of baked into the sauce. When you print money and give it to a select few people, you're going to create wealth inequality, and that money is not trickling down to people who look like us. And I've been saying it for years, and now we're here. But anyway, so I always thought the economy was a bubble looking for a pen, and the pandemic provided that pen, and we'll see where we go from here. But looks like the economy is slowly reopening, so it's going to get better in the short term. We'll see how it goes long term. Looks like going to print as much money as he can to make sure the economy doesn't turn down his watch. He's going to keep printing money. Now he has an infrastructure bill, which I also wrote about, infrastructure plan, which I also wrote about. But so I think for the short term, the economy is going to slowly reopen, and we'll see how it works out long term. If that's going to be a double dip recession or dead cat bounce, or if it's going to be a economic expansion for certain members of society, but still some people get left behind who are not part of the investor class. We see if that scenario plays out.
Yeah, I think we may already be in the dead cat bounce, as I was voting for the dead cat bounce since last year. But the stimulus checks As everybody call them, the stimmy checks.
Yeah.
The stimulus checks went out, and we already see
Right.
consumer
Yeah.
discretionary spending has been rising pretty quickly. So I think we're in that period a little bit faster than I guesstimated. I was guesstimating around summer, essentially summer to fall. We would see that dead cat bounce, but I think we're seeing it now. So I think I have to push up my timeline that by summer to fall, we may be experiencing the continued decline post dead cat bounce. Uh,
Wow. Wow.
yeah,
You're such a Debbie Downer.
I know, right?
I find that hard to believe. You're such a Debbie Downer. Not like me. Not like me.
I should
Always
work for
chipper.
the gloom and doom report.
Always chipper and upbeat. What do you
Exactly.
want with me? Wake up in a bad mood. What do you people bother me for? Wake up in a bad mood. Anyway, so well, it gets worse because Tamir Rice's mother, Samaria Rice, got her dander up last week.
Yeah.
She called out some of the high-profile activists, for which I guess the short answer would be that what she gets called like a grift, where you have these who are probably having events, selling T-shirts, selling merch, raising money, going on TV and becoming socialites and having commercials and going and attending the Grammy events off of some people's pain, experiencing this pain, may not be getting any of the financial benefits, or you have sort of activists getting to the bag, and the people who are actually suffering from these police misconduct or other events are being left out in the cold. So I'll read her official statements. This is the official statement from Samaria Rice, mother Tamir Rice, and Lisa Simpson, mother Richard Risher. And Tamir Rice, I think it happened a few years ago, where he was a 12-year-old kid who was playing with a
Yep.
toy gun at I guess at a park, and he was acting like he was shooting at people, what have you, and the people probably knew it was a toy gun, but some people were kind of scared. I think someone called the police, but the guy who called the police probably thought it was a toy gun. When he called the police, he probably sentenced Tamir Rice to his death, because the police, when you saw the video, after the police's explanation was that they were afraid for their lives, but when you saw the
Yep.
video, the police pulled up to the kid, up close to him, so you could be in so you could be near him. So when you open the door, you have an excuse to shoot him. If you really thought this kid had a gun, or you really wanted to defuse the situation, you would have stopped 30, 40 yards away from him. I thought. It seemed like the police officer was looking for some action and the excuse to shoot. And the 12-year-old kid boy didn't have a chance. Video. But here's Samaria Rice's official statement. Okay, it said Tamika D. Mallory, Sean King, Benjamin Crump, Lee Merritt, Police Patrice Cullors, Melina Abdullah, and the Black Lives Matter global network need to step down, stand back, and stop monopolizing and capitalizing our fight for justice and human rights. We never hired them to be the representatives in the fight for justice for our dead loved ones murdered by the police. The activists, quote unquote, have events in our cities and have not given us anything substantial for using our loved ones' images and names on their flyers. The attorneys in our fight are also misleading the impacted families. In the case of Tamir Rice, it was even questionable as to whether Benjamin Crump knew the laws in depth in the state of Ohio. I fired him 6 to 8 months into Tamir's case. We don't want or need y'all parading in the streets, accumulating donations, platforms, movie deals, etc., off the death of our loved ones, while the families and communities are left clueless and broken. Don't say our loved ones' names, period. That's our truth. I think Lisa Simpson, the mother of Richard Risher, also made a
Mhm.
statement where she said that I think people raised money for her son's funeral, and I don't think they saw any money from it. They never saw a penny from it. But I think what particularly got Samaria Rice's dander up was appearance of Tamika Mallory
Right.
at the Grammys, where she appeared with Lil Baby um, doing a performance. So I think that's what prompted the statement. But uh, and then we also discussed to her defense, Miss Mallory's response to Samaria Rice. So I'll give that you we'll listen to your take on what Miss Rice had to say. You can kind of hear. It's kind of hard to really critique what she said because it sounds like a grieving mother, and we all people in the black community knows what
Yeah,
that sounds like,
it's
and we all know what it feels like.
uh it's already, I think, tough to one is, something that we were kind of talking about, you know, growing up during the era of, during the crack epidemic. You almost get desensitized to some degree when you're around so much violence. And that violence seems to be indiscriminate to adults, children, etc. And, thankfully, we've, I think, moved past that type of grotesque, in your face violence. There was a time when typically Miami, kind of during the late 70s, the gang wars that were happening between the drug cartels that were being played out in the streets of Miami, and seeing these violent shootouts, seeing people get murdered and slain almost without care. Thankfully, in some ways, we've moved past that type of violence. But I think the difference is that between today and then is that we could turn, if you didn't live in those communities that were inundated, if you didn't live in Harlem or Detroit or Miami or DC or in LA that was inundated by that type of violence that came along with our communities being flooded with drugs, you could always turn off the TV and go on with your day. You could ignore the news, the newspaper, and kind of go on with your day. Whereas now we live in a time where, most of our lives are spent on a phone. And there really isn't any turning away from the violent scenes of watching us continue to be murdered. And I think the biggest difference between the violence that was viewed in the late 70s all the way out to really the mid 90s was that a significant portion of it was finger pointing as interpersonal violence, or is black on black crime, while we never heard Asian on Asian crime, white on white crime. So in other words, this type of violence was labeled as, it's Negroes killing other Negroes. So it was labeled as our problem. Whereas when you're watching an officer of the law, this is state sanctioned violence. That's a different type of violence. That is a violence that is being authorized. And that changes the dynamics. And along with the fact that you can't necessarily turn this off, in other words. So even for us that are a bit older, that have lived through those, through the times of the late 70s, early 80s and 90s, to see this violence kind of reemerge, but at the hands of the state, it certainly still has a personal impact. In other words, it still has a depth, still not desensitized so much that, in some instances, it becomes overwhelming. In other words, and it's already, at least for me personally, it's already enough to see, not only a George Floyd, but a Philando Castile, who did everything right, who alerted the police officer that I am armed, but I'm also a card carrying member. NRA has his concealed weapon card, did everything that even the NRA says to do when you interact with police, when you are carrying your concealed weapon, and had his 4-year-old daughter sitting in the back, and the police officer not having enough empathy that his life was so worthless that he had no murdering him in front of his child. And now that child has to live, long after the cameras are gone,
Right.
long after the spotlight is gone. That girl is still living with the fact that her father was murdered in front of her, that her mother remained helpless while her father was being murdered in front of her, that she was helpless while her father was being murdered in front of her. They don't have to deal with those consequences. That officer, even if he were thrown under the jail, he doesn't have to live with the consequences of that child and her psychological and emotional impact, and how it's going to shape and frame her upbringing from that point on. We may never know what she would have been like, what her potential would have been like, had she not had to witness that, had to go through that and experience that. And I say all of that to, I guess, bring it down to a very real level. So when we're talking about, at least when I was reading Samaria Rice's statement, I couldn't watch Tamir Rice. I couldn't watch the video. By that point, I was already burnt out mentally. As a father, my number one responsibility to my family is to make sure that my family's protected. And I feel that whether that is an acknowledgement for any parent, whether it's vocalized or not, I believe that that's our inherent job, that we take it as, that we have to protect our children. And to witness this young boy get just slaughtered down as if his life didn't mean anything in the seconds prior to it, I couldn't watch it. I was just at a place where I couldn't do it. I couldn't watch it as a father. I couldn't watch it. So reading her statements, I could do nothing but empathize. There's a righteous anger there. I think, for most of us, there are some parents that to this day, I still don't understand how they take their own children's lives. I often think about the days that, you spend when your children are first born and the nights that you spend up, making sure that they're fed and listening to their cries and making sure that they're comforted. And, that fatherly sense of making sure your children have all that they need. And I can only imagine what that experience is like for a mother. They carry the child. And so, in other words, the grief, in my perspective, has to be compounded. As a mother, to know that you carry this child not only to term, but every day you carry your children. Every day you ensure that child goes out to be safe into the world. So when I read her statement, I can only feel a righteous sense of anger. I can only empathize with the fact that here's a child that no one barely knew. The only way that he's become famous is through his death. In fact, chances are we probably would have taken this child for granted because he was a young black boy. Young black boys don't get treated favorably. Life outcomes speak to that. Incarceration rates, lowest mortality rates in the country. lowest income rates. So the country that we live in tells us that we really don't care that much about young black boys and their experiences. So chances are he would have been another one of these children that we would have not really cared about until his death. So in other words, I saw that when I read her sentiment or her statement. Um, that's what I felt. It kind of took me back to that place that, to watch folks that would have otherwise not been there unless her child was dead. Like, who was her child to Sean King? Who was her child to Tamika Mallory? Who was her child to Jesse Jackson? Who was her child, to Al Sharpton before he was no longer there? Who was her child when he had a cold on a Tuesday evening? And she was probably at her wit's end, but she still had to practice some patience. Where were they then? In other words, for the carrying of this child's upbringing. So the only time that they show up is in the community of death, actually. And so while, we didn't hear from Tamika Mallory when she first wrote that statement yet, I could only empathize with it. To your point, how do you critique that? Because that is a personal experience. Even if it is an inaccurate critique to BLM, to Tamika Mallory, to Sean King, in the totality of their work, is much like any other role that, even if you're a physician, while the majority of your patients may have great and wonderful things stated about you, but there were some patients that fell through the cracks, that their diagnosis was misdiagnosed. Maybe their treatments were neglected. And they have a very different experience. So their experience, while it doesn't invalidate the totality of your work, but should we ignore their experience? Should we push their experience with you to the side? In other words, so I think that's where the value in her statement lies. That that is her experience. She is a mother that I don't think will ever move past a point of grief because that was her child, that was her son, who she had to carry, love, sacrifice for, and carry for. So, that was my initial, where my headspace was when I first read it.
Right. It's a lot to unpack. I mean, it's a brave thing that she did because you almost forget about while these activists stay in the media, and the media doesn't really
Yeah.
talk that much about Samaria Rice, and she's going to tell you straight. And I'm not sure the corporate media wants to hear her message per se. She's going to tell us straight. I mean, from the video, looked like this police officer baited her son, drove up close to him just so he could have a shootout with a 12-year-old kid. Um, I thought it was. I was kind of shocked. Maybe I just followed the turnip truck, but I was kind of shocked that from the statement and that it seems like what she's saying is that the Tamir Rice Foundation people are giving more to
Mhm.
other
Yeah.
foundations than
Yeah.
they are to the Tamir Rice Foundation. You know what I'm saying? I'm not sure that people. It seemed to me you would give to the Tamir Rice Foundation, or if you're out there fundraising, um, let's say bringing attention to the Tamir Rice situation to make sure he gets a fair trial. That's a good thing. And a lot of family members are vulnerable. They're upset already, and they're not. They can't. They have no idea who all these people coming out to Cleveland, wherever these incidents are happening. They're vulnerable, and they could use any help they can to help bring attention to these cases to make sure at least the pressure brought on district attorney or pressure put on the police department or the media to ensure that her child gets a fair trial and something done about this. So I think it's a good thing to bring attention to it, but at the same time, I assume that they were raising money. They're also going to help raise money for the Tamir Rice Foundation, raise money for the mother and the family, not just for themselves. I had no idea that's what was going on. Um, I thought that kind of shocked me a little bit. And she named names specifically, so she seems like she has some type of I guess some type of receipts as far as at least some people who she called out as maybe using Torian Rice's name to sell merch or to have events or raise money. I know. I thought it was odd a couple years ago. Some people in the media had the I guess first or
Yeah.
15-year anniversary of the Ferguson uprisings. There were people from the corporate media
Right.
involved in this event,
Yeah.
and there was nobody, no local activists from Ferguson on the panel. I thought that was the strangest thing. Like you're gonna have first year anniversary of Ferguson, but you're not gonna have local activists from Ferguson on the panel. And these local activists were the ones out there 12, 14, 16-hour days marching to bring attention to Michael Brown, that this young black kid had gotten gunned down in broad daylight. They're bringing attention to the fact that this young kid had died. They were tweeting about it. I remember they were tweeting about it the day it happened every day. It took the corporate media like a week to figure out, maybe week to 10 days to catch on. But these people were tweeting about it and keeping this incident alive. These in social media. Uh, so they were the ones out there 16, 18-hour days, and you have a first year anniversary of the events of Ferguson, and people from Ferguson are now on the panel. You have people from the corporate media all around these big urban areas who are not from out in Ferguson, explaining what's going on in Ferguson. Like the people from Ferguson, a bunch of deaf mutes. I also thought it was odd that you see all these people out there protesting in
Yeah.
Ferguson, and
Yeah.
none of these people were ever on TV.
Yeah.
None of these people, no activists from Ferguson were ever on TV. They were never, and I thought that was weird. Like, how come you're not talking to any of the activists, some of the people who are out there locally who maybe can explain to you what Michael Brown was feeling or what the community is feeling? I know Marisha
Yeah.
Paladel, I know she stood tall for the black community out in Ferguson. She'd been to on this event a couple times, but she was the one who kind of
Yeah.
schooled me to what was going on. That like
Yeah.
people like DeRay McKesson and some of the other people weren't even from Ferguson. I guess it's DeRay McKesson and Netta, I think her name
Yeah.
is.
It's Baltimore.
Maybe she's from Ferguson. They said DeRay McKesson wasn't even from Ferguson.
Yeah. Yeah.
She's from Baltimore. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. That people speaking about
Yep.
Ferguson and writing books about Ferguson weren't even from Ferguson. And I thought that was odd. So corporate
Hmm.
media seemed like they pick these sort of Negro whisperers who speak on behalf of black folks who they feel comfortable with. And I mean they're always gonna be Negro whisperers, but to the extent that they're gonna be speaking for on behalf um, of real situations in these communities, I think it's should not be tolerated. They get to walk in front of people from these communities. We don't know who
Yeah.
the real activists in Ferguson were. Some of these
Yeah.
people have been murdered. Darren Seals and some of the other activists have been murdered. And so, make a long story short, I just kind of thought that was something germane to maybe Ferguson and a couple other places. I didn't know it was germane to Cleveland too, and to Tamir Rice situation. And she's basically saying, we didn't ask you to represent us. Stop representing us. Stop selling merch. Stop holding events. Um, Using our grievances, our grief as sort of a platform to raise money, to raise
Yeah.
funds, and to line your own pockets, and to get the bag. That's kind of what she was saying in short. In short,
I was just
go ahead.
agreeing that pretty much everything you were saying is Darren Seals, and rest in peace to King Seals, and essentially that cohort of grassroots Ferguson organizers. But Darren Seals was calling this out years ago. He was calling this out, and that's what I think a lot of folks, continue to suspect is the reason for his murder. I believe they labeled it either suicide or still unknown causes. It was a gruesome way to find his body in a burnt vehicle with a bullet in his head, I believe. So, and three other, if I'm correct, I believe two or three other of his cohorts were found the same way or in a very similar fashion. And I think, really the year prior to his death, he had been beating that drum. There is on the ground grassroots exploitation. We really watch the rise of the social justice careerist right before our eyes, where you have a D-Ray that, had this iconic photo taken of him kneeling and, just kind of just at the right moment, and watch his blue vest catapult into infamy. All of a sudden, he goes from Ferguson to rubbing elbows with celebrities, getting book deals. He's, getting TED Talks, getting private talks at different corporate institutions, making commercials. It really was sickening to watch. In all honesty, meanwhile, the folks on Ferguson never stopped that entire time. All while the snapshots were going to D-Ray and Glitz and Glamour and others, because it wasn't just D-Ray alone. That's when you really saw the rise of Sean King. That's when you really saw the rise of even the celebrity activists, along with BLM. And certain folks like D-Ray, like Sean King, were being almost pinged out of the group of grassroots organizers. And it was only later that you find out that, D-Ray literally set that shot up. It wasn't, he really wasn't protesting. He literally was, taking a shot for the gram. And he actually set up the shot to be taken at that time. So it really speaks to me, a devious intentionality. I think, I think even folks would be willing to concede that if there was not such a constructed activism, essentially you're cosplaying activist, folks could concede to you just so happen to gaining some spotlight as a result of being in the front. But when you can watch the folks that are actually on the ground doing the work, like you stated, 12, 14 hours, day in, day out, just like with Breonna Taylor, when I believe Professor Brittany, not Cunningham, but her last name is blanking on me. But she goes by the name Professor Crunk on Twitter. But she was making the accusation inaccurately that, folks didn't care about Breonna Taylor until spotlight was there. Meanwhile, folks had been marching, and specifically Black men had been on those streets of St. Louis marching for Breonna Taylor months before her name became a household name, every single day. And these are the folks that quite often get overlooked, to your point, and to Darren Seal's point, and so many others. And this is the same sentiment that Samira Rice is echoing. I think is just simply validating the same reason why Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson went from the prominence that they had within the Black community to their credibility being what it is. And those of us that are actually in the communities that they claim to represent, their name is quite often mud in those communities. The only time that you typically see them and the sentiment that's echoed in those communities is that, they're just pariahs. They look for a cause, they look for something to jump on, and they're looked at as opportunists. Well, if you, I think, do one or two things over a 20, 30-year period, the actual work you're doing will outweigh the perception of the work within the communities that you're actually impacting. But the fact that the perception of them within our communities is that they are opportunists, it has to hold some type of validity there. That's something that you're doing is giving so many folks that impression. I have never once heard anyone make a critique of Jesse Jackson or Al Sharpton and their name be defended. I've never once heard somebody, whether it's the barbershop, whether it's on the street corner, whether it's in a household, whether it's at a party, I've never heard when Al Sharpton's name or Jesse Jackson's name brought up and in connection with them being opportunists, I've never once heard somebody, but I've never heard that. I never once heard somebody be like, nah, man, you got them all wrong. But I'm like, nah. Like, there is a resounding consensus every single time that their name, it is. And so to me, that speaks to
an echo, right?
The body of work that you within that community, that the only time that you see folks defending their name is when it's on a pulpit or when it's in front of a camera. When is Al Sharpton ever defended? When John Lewis is standing in front of a microphone. When is Jesse Jackson ever defended? When John Lewis was standing in front of a microphone. So in other words, there's a disconnect there. So I think it speaks to the validity of what Samaria Rice is saying. In other words, that, you may, for some folks, you may be doing the work, or they may feel like you're doing the work, but there's a large swath of folks that feel exploited. And I think we have to listen to that. When so many of our people that are actually on the ground and that are doing the work are echoing these sentiments, whether you agree or disagree, you have to at least take a listen. You have to at least hear the critique, and you have to, even if you push back on the critique, because Roland Martin pushed back on the critique, specifically when it came to Tamika Mallory. He didn't defend anybody else.
Of course
he specifically defended Tamika Mallory. So, and he rightfully pushed back. He said, "Show the proof." Go ahead.
Has he ever
say that one more time?
Has he ever defended Patrisse Cullors?
I don't know. I don't watch Roland Martin that often. I know he's had her on to know, but I will say that within that.
All right. Yeah. Okay. That's a good answer. That's a good answer.
Plausible deniability.
That's a good answer. I was testing you.
You know me, like I'm very direct. I don't miss words.
Go ahead.
But I will say that he did not defend Patrisse Cullors within Samaria Rice's statement. The only person that I heard him defend, the only person that I heard him specifically push back on was Tamika Mallory, in terms of, if you're going to critique her, you better do it with some proof. He spent 20 minutes. I don't even know what was the point of having the other three people on the panel at the time, because it was just mainly him ranting for 30 minutes and essentially getting the other three people to agree with his rant. But even within the rant, he had a valid point, though, which was, if you are going to critique folks, if you're going to say that the folks that are doing the work are not doing the work or are doing something shady, then you need to produce the evidence, put it on the table so that we can all see it. And whether you agree with him or not in terms of his kind of defense of Tamika Mallory, he still brings up a valid point that if we're going to say that, hey, you ain't doing, it, then we need to make sure that there's some evidence there evidencing that claim. So that way it can be put on the table. And Tamika Mallory, echo his sentiments that, she specifically said that, name the time and place. I'll debate anybody. I was a little confused with the format, because I'll say I don't think is necessarily constructive as a debate necessarily, but I guess maybe it's a little bit nuanced. But in other words, need to debate whether Tamika Mallory is a grifter or not. But can we critique based on evidence of your work? Have you addressed either these inconsistencies or this evidence? Then yes, there should be a conversation, and there should be rooted in some evidence that, hey, here's what's going on. What is your response to that? Do you see how, do you see the perception of this evidence? And, fill us in. What's of this evidence versus the perception of this evidence, to then further jump down that rabbit hole for accountability, because that's really what that all ends up being, is accountability based on transparency. So yeah, brother, that's pretty much my 2 cents on it.
Right. A couple of things. From the person when I looked at her statement, I think Samaria Rice really only called out. She named names, but she kind of specifically talked about talked about the attorneys. So my impression was that she had some direct contact with the attorneys. Whether it was Lee Merritt or Benjamin Crump. My impression was that she was more offended by Tamika Mallory being on the Grammys, like she's being a celebrity activist. Not that she had any contact with her. It's almost like the same way a lot of intellectuals looked at Cornel West when he was in the movie.
The Matrix
with Keanu Reeves.
Yeah.
Yeah, remember he was in the Matrix? Like, it's like, are you? It's like, are you serious right now? Are you really an intellectual, or you just you just turned into an entertainer now? Because you're coming off. Sometimes you was he rapping sometimes? Seemed like he was rapping sometimes, and seemed like he was like becoming like really like a Swiss Army knife, just not intellectual, but he had cashed in with for the celebrity of it all. Not that there's anything wrong with that. He can do what he wants, but can you play both sides of the fence? Can you go be in the Matrix and then turn around and have a, you know what I mean? And then so I think my impression was that Samaria Rice was more taken aback by the fact that Tamika Mallory was at the Grammys with Lil Baby, while she's still struggling, she can't get funding for Tamika Rice Foundation. Not that she had any direct contact with Tamika Mallory. Other themes. I think a couple other themes that I think you're seeing is something that's ingrained in Black culture. I think Dr. Paul Henderson talks about this. It's called meritorious manumission. You may feel like it's accurate or not, but he says there's 3 ways to get your freedom papers faster than other slaves on the plantation. The doctrine came from Virginia. that started in Virginia, that you could defend the plantation. You had to create something that the slave master made 100% of profits off of, or snitch on other blacks. And it said over 220 slave uprisings.
Yep.
Every uprising, black person snitched. So you have this thing where blacks have been rewarded to undermine other blacks. And if you go out into Ferguson and you're watching these activists out there who the local police know who's really doing the work and who's
Right.
being effective, those are the ones who they're bothering. They out there
Yeah.
supporting
I
your
mean,
ways, and you out there getting the bag. You're basically undermining what other black folks. You're undermining what other black folks are doing, whether it's in Ferguson or whether it's in Cleveland or what have you. You out there raising money, and not to make a Mallory per se, but someone, anyone who's raising money using Tamir Rice's name in the Tamir Rice Foundation is not can't raise any money. That's something kind of something's kind of squirrely about that. And it seems like you have some people who are more, whether it's DeRay or people from Black Lives Matter, who are more, I don't know if it's camera ready or um, people, may have a bigger platform or something that they have that people want to give them money for
right.
something, rather than give money directly to the families. You know what I'm saying? And this concept of grifters is not just um, when it comes to social justice, and it's rampant throughout black folks. I mean, I write a book about Prince Edward County. Next thing you know, that all these people talking about Prince Edward County, all these books about Prince Edward County from people who don't even know any black folks in Prince Edward County, who are speaking for black folks in Prince Edward County like we're a bunch of deaf mutes and we can't speak for ourselves, or we're illiterate, we can't read or write. And so you have people who either clicked up with the book industry, or clicked up with the corporate media, and have a bigger platform, and they're using that platform for their own personal gain rather than to bring shed light onto certain events. So that seems to be kind of like the prevailing thing. You have blacks undermining other blacks. You have blacks who maybe have more sway with the media, corporate media, or corporations for some whatever reason. Maybe they can put a, 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 um, a slick PowerPoint presentation together or something. I don't know, but that seems to be what's going on in the black community, not just in social justice arena, but whether it's in the media or what have you. And even with Breonna Taylor, I remember there were people went down there to have an event, not from Louisville. It's just, I'm not gonna name any names, but typical celebrities. Every time there's an event on social justice, you have these certain rappers and certain media personalities go down there to host an event to get a
Well,
bag, and I didn't see any local people on the panel. And I guess they would say, if I'm from New York, if I'm in New York and I'm a celebrity, or if I'm a rapper and I can bring people to an event, why? That's my business. Why should
right.
I?
No,
Am
you
I
know what?
obligated to help you raise money?
I actually recently read a
Even
piece
though,
because one, you're right that there has been a historical presence of backstabbing and I think that's going to exist regardless of whether a group is colonized or not, whether a group is oppressed or not. Even in the oppressor class, there are folks that will always take a selfish route because there's something in it for them, even at the sacrifice of the greater community. So I don't think that characteristic is unique to a colonized group of folks like enslaved Africans at the time. However, it just has a greater consequence for us when you're dealing with an oppressed group of
okay,
people versus the oppressor class themselves. That's really the difference, is what is the consequence of a traitorous behavior. However, fast forward, I was recently reading a piece by Erica Garner. And she was talking about, and rest in peace, Erica Garner, because she has since passed, believe of heart problems, heart condition, and I don't even think she turned 30 yet. but which was already heartbreaking, because essentially the rest of her life since her father's murder, she spent every single day fighting for justice for her father, only never to see it, only to see the officer even get promoted and make more money since him murdering her father. But she wrote a piece, I believe it was for Medium. She wrote the piece, but I think it was really insightful in terms of what folks experience that never intended to be activists. I don't think anything in her life brought her to a state of activism like her father's death. And when you are in one particular space and life's movement pushes you in a different space, you aren't necessarily prepared to be in that space and all that it encompasses. So a couple pieces that stood out within that piece. So one, she talked about how she struggled. She struggled attention to her father's death after all of the kind of lights and cameras died down. She was like, there was kind of a silence that happened, that once the 15 minutes were up, folks no longer cared about it. We kind of moved on to the next death. And now his name simply became, one of the hashtags at the top of the t-shirt. And that's pretty much it. But in terms of actually pushing for actionable justice, she talked about how there was very little resources. So she had to reach out to some of these folks. And I believe it was Al Sharpton's organization, National Action Network, that helped her organize a march. And all of a sudden she was starting to get in front of podiums and getting larger audiences where, she struggled to get 100 people to show up. They were able to get a few thousand to show up. So kind of speaking to that visibility that you spoke to earlier. But now her issue is that essentially it was kind of like getting, a snake to go after the rat. You saw getting rid of the rat out the house, but now you got a snake in the house and now you need to get rid of that. So, because now you've created this beast.
Doesn't want to leave. Right.
Where she ends the article, as a matter of fact, talking about how when it came time for her to speak, that the event ultimately failed. The reason that the event failed, because they were supposed to march. They were supposed to do, and it was supposed to be, I guess, a surprise direct action march. But the police were able to circumvent the march completely, block them off and keep them limited to one section. You know why? Because the organizers of the event, in addition, she was obviously the primary organizer, but the other more experienced organizers were literally fighting over credit. Who's going to get the credit for this event? Whose name is going to go in the news ticker? Who's going to get the most time? And they literally spent 20 something minutes arguing in the open, to the point where she yelled at them, what are you doing? And all while they were arguing, it literally gave the police the window, because they overheard where they were going, the streets they were supposed to march on. They heard everything. They heard the entire plan, all because they were arguing over who's going to take credit for what. And the police had time to deploy resources. And when I read that, the the realist in me had to wonder, was that intentional? Was that argument intentional in order to give the police the time that they needed? Were those things, an experienced organizer understands that you have traitors in your midst, that you have folks that are feeding information back to certain entities that are going to try to block direct action movements. Any experienced or grassroots organizer knows this is fundamental. And for you to be exposing certain activities out in the open, not everything is for public consumption. Really, that there was some intention there. And while Erica Gardner herself never acknowledged intentionality in that argument, but it's certainly the experience that she talked about of the organizers, to me, had me questioning that. But the larger point was that ultimately the movement was stepped on by the very same folks that she reached out to for visibility. And I think, while I don't recall her saying it or writing it in the article, but the sentiment that I got was a tone of regret, that she regretted either not being able to handle, either not being prepared for that type of response. But I think that there's a reality there that, Samira Rice's, Philando Castile's girlfriend, each one of these folks may not have already been in a space of activism. So they may not have already known where the catch-alls are, where the pitfalls are, what the game is. And there are professional organizers that, much like folks that, work for election campaigns, they know where the bottlenecks are. They know how to prepare for a campaign. So they can go into a campaign and splice the difference between branding and a speech and the different donors and the intentionality of those donors. And you know what I mean? Just essentially the lay of the land. And I think that there is a certain degree of ignorance and naivety that when you're entering those spaces, really inadvertently, kind of life pushes you there, that there is a lot of room for exploitation, that folks are going to exploit that naivety. Folks are counting on that naivety, and they're going to pounce on it. That is their room to grift, frankly. And I also think that it opens up the door, though, for for someone like a Tamika Mallory, who may have been collateral damage. In turn, she got hit by a ricochet bullet that may not have really meant for her, because maybe her activities are sincere and are committed to the community, but because she moves with those same folks, but maybe not in the same way, that the perception is the same, although the reality differs. And it's in those details. And that kind of speaks to the need for transparency and accountability, to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff, as we say, like what's real and what's pretending to be real. And there's a lot of folks that are pretending to be real, but the intentions are, when you're spending more time in front of, corporate sponsorships, and you're spending more time with celebrities and, speaking engagements, versus actually organizing the community. So yeah, I think that's really what it kind of speaks to as well, man.
Well, Tamika Mallory, she and my son did an interview where she basically said that she kind of apologized. She said that I think we were all let down, Samaria Rice and her son, and she offered to reach out to Samaria Rice and talk offline and not have it sort of in a public sphere. These two women sort of having a disagreement, but to talk behind the scenes, which I thought was good. She said she's never. She said I
No.
think she said she hadn't mentioned Tamir Rice's name. That she hadn't. It wasn't true. But I think my impression that Samaria Rice may have been
Yeah.
taken aback by the fact that she was at the Grammys with Lil Baby and
I think it was just a trigger for Samira Rice. I think that's really what it represented, was just a trigger.
Right, 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 right. And I think activists have a right to make money. I think they have a right to make a living. I think they have a right to, if you know, because nobody can bring light to all these events, especially with police misconduct, because the police department has more of a, they have more resources, and the corporate media has more resources than all of us put together. So it takes a lot of effort and a lot of energy to bring light to these situations when you and get it in front of corporate media and get it in front of social media. So they have a right to make a living. And I'm not. I don't think that's what Samaria Rice was calling. I think she was basically calling on people who may not be
Yeah. Yeah.
that genuine. And I think that was more. I think that was more of her focus. But there are like there are grifters amongst us, and it just seems like it's kind of like a real low to try to take advantage of a mother's grief when she's at a real vulnerable time, or family's grief in general when they're at a vulnerable time. They out there
Right.
grieving, and not gonna see she's never gonna see her son again. Someone else trying to figure out how they're gonna get a bag off of this. That's exactly what happened with Black Lives Matter and Michael Brown. I think Michael Brown's dad. So where's the money?
Yep.
You should give me $20 million. Where's the money? You're raising all this money based on
Yep.
the death of my son, but we haven't seen any of the money, and we haven't anointed you. We haven't anointed you to work on our behalf. Or
No,
speak on our
I
behalf.
championed his. I love that
And
him and the young brother,
he had,
who has his own organization. And I can't believe I'm drawing a blank on the organization because I actually follow them as well. Matter of fact, my son and I had a little bit of a civil exchange on social media as well about this very topic. And one of the things that I think we have to make a distinction between is activism and activists and revolutionaries. And I think that, to my son's point, who has been an activist, especially for, like, he and I have actually crossed paths when it comes to activism, specifically for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals, making sure that they have the resources that they need when they come out to prevent any recidivism rates, etc. But his point is just that they have a right to make a living. It does take resources. However, to the pushback, I think one of the things, if we don't clearly define the roles, this is where the confusion and the mix-up comes in. That if you're an activist, you can have corporate sponsorships. If you're an activist, you can, sell books. You can be a D-Ray and be an activist. You can be sponsored by Wells Fargo. You can go on TED Talks. You can hobnob with the cast of Blackish and try to spread the gospel of the social justice careerists. You can be an activist and do all of those things. What you cannot be is a revolutionary and do all of those things. There is a difference between Fred Hampton and even a Tamika Mallory. Tamika Mallory is an activist. My son is an activist. Fred Hampton and Black Panther Party were revolutionaries. And the difference is that you cannot be a revolutionary and have a corporate sponsorship. You cannot be a revolutionary and funded by Shell and Wells Fargo and JP Morgan. Revolutionaries don't get airtime on TV. Revolutionaries don't get corporate sponsorships over their banners. This is the difference even between the Tamika Mallorys and the D. Ray McKessons and the Sean Kings and the Darren Seals, is that one was in the spirit of revolution and one was in the spirit of activism. Activism is simply a representation of a reform. When we talk about harm reduction, revolution does not seek to reform. Revolution seeks to destroy and rebuild. And that's the difference, is that when you are participating in grassroots organizing in the spirit of revolution for the community, it requires a dismantling of the system. The corporatocracy is not going to sponsor a Fred Hampton, certainly that is speaking to the destruction of their very existence. That's why the politics of a Myson and a Tamika Mallory are in alignment with the corporate sponsorship. That's why there is no deviation, simply because you're not looking to destroy and rebuild, which is also why BLM could have a corporate sponsorship. That's why they raised over $10.6 billion during a pandemic. Black Panther Party has never raised $10.6 billion. Certainly not the PAIGC by Amilcar Cabral, certainly not the All African People's Revolutionary Party that Kwame Ture built, and certainly not the Organization for African Unity, the AAU that Malcolm X built. These organizations were not getting corporate sponsorship. Well, guess what? Corporate sponsorship existed even then. This isn't a new phenomenon. That corporate interests, in fact, some of the earliest corporate interests was Freedmen's Bank. When Freedmen's Bank, which was pushed as a black-owned bank, when in fact it was a white-owned bank with a black face. Well, who did they put in front of that bank when it was already failing? Was none other than Frederick Douglass. So he could take the hit and the fault for the fraud that was going on. But we can also look to Booker T. Washington, who was arguably a corporate sponsored entity. That's why they quite often went to him as the primary Negro whisperer when it came to the Atlanta Convention, for him to convince the corporate sponsors, which was the former slave owning class, to join in the plight of the self-determined Negro at the time to do itself. Well, that was a corporate sponsor event comparatively. So in other words, history has shown us this blueprint. What is new is, I think, that becoming a particular career path, and certainly how quickly it has evolved because of social media, our communication and technology gives us the ability to become a voice, to be able to stand out much faster than in Booker T's days. But we've seen this blueprint, in other words, before, and that blueprint is nothing new. But when we conflate revolutionary with activism, I think this is where we inherently get this argument of these folks can't be this, they can't do this and represent the community. I think, if someone like Tamika Mallory, at least that I know of, I don't really follow her, but in the little that I've watched specifically regarding this topic, I have never once heard her identify herself as a revolutionary. I've never heard Sean King identify himself as a revolutionary. I've never heard a lot of these folks identify themselves as revolutionaries. And if anyone knows the history of a revolutionary struggle, Haiti was revolutionary. better known as Haiti, for us English speakers. But 1804 was revolutionary. Dessalines was revolutionary. Toussaint was revolutionary. Amilcar Cabral, revolutionary. Kwame Nkrumah, revolutionary. Even Idi Amin, revolutionary. But the Bayard Rustins of the world, not a revolutionary. He was an activist, also a CIA informant, but he was not a revolutionary. And there's a difference. And I think that is why even King was never seen as a revolutionary. That's why we had the ideological differences, and Martin. And that's why so many folks tend to go to King, especially when it's racial injustice, especially when even in a counter argument that the extreme right comes up with about reverse, etc. And their go-to is King. Well, what would King have done? What would like you about King? Right? They never moved past the "I have a dream" speech, and they never moved past 2 to 3 lines, even within the "I have a dream" speech. But the point is that there's a reason why, and never Malcolm. There's a reason why they go to John Lewis and never Kwame Ture. There's even a reason why Bill Clinton, even in John Lewis's funeral, denigrated Kwame Ture. There's a reason why he said that SNCC and successful under John Lewis and not the black. He specifically black power. Because what was Kwame Ture's contribution outside of his organizing to SNCC? It was giving them the slogan of black power. And John Lewis's eulogy specifically denigrated that. So there's a reason why they go to these folks, why they go to the John Lewises, why they go to the Martin Luther Kings, why they go to the Bayard Rustins, why they even go to the Harry Belafontes in those days and the Sidney Poitiers. You know why? Because the state will never, ever align with revolutionary action. Revolutionary action requires the dismantling of the state. So if we cannot expect the same from an activist that we expect from a revolutionary. And I think that's where our perception is coming from, and even where the critiques are coming from, because an activist can make a living from this. Typically, a revolutionary will not be paid by a corporate entity. That's just not that's not how it works. And I think that distinction is important to make, important to keep in mind, because it then helps frame the critique. I don't know if that's something that Samira Rice had in mind with her, when she came out to critique BLM. BLM certainly has be revolutionary. When you talk about trained Marxists, right, when Patrisse Cullors and Alicia Garza identify themselves as trained Marxists, and yet your actions are antithetical to Marxism, well, at that point, you're simply cosplaying revolutionary. There's a lot of folks that dress like revolutionary, afros like revolutionaries, that put up a fist like revolutionaries, but they are not taking actions nor principle stands as revolutionaries. That's the difference between a revolutionary and an activist, is principles. Those principles are your guiding measures to know, do you take a check from Shell? Does your banner, should it include an insignia for Wells Fargo? When you are, journalist Nicole Hannah Smith, or Nicole Hannah Jones, produced a phenomenal piece of work, was able to produce the 1619 Project. But let's not conflate her work with a revolutionary action. That's why that ad of her in Team Project, where, beautiful ad, beautiful sister, sitting in the middle, and then right above her head is sponsored by Shell. Well, listen, I spoke to the fact that Malcolm X turned down $6 million, not once, not twice, not three times. He turned down a $6 million payday that the FBI kept trying to push, not even to simply turn on the movement, but simply to feed them consistent information about the movement. So he didn't even have to be a complete turncoat. He could have just dipped his toe in the waters of betrayal for a $6 million payday. And remember, this is at a time when he's already out of the NOI. He's primarily largely on his own. He's building up the OAAU, but he does not have the strength of support within the community that he had prior to leaving the NOI, in other words. So they were primarily from pillow to post. They were living in dire poverty. A $6 million payday would have changed their absolute lives. And Malcolm turned $6 million down more than once. This is the difference between a revolutionary and an activist. An activist would have taken, they wouldn't have even had the offer $6 million. That would have been a 300x overpayment. They could have offered them $1,000, and these folks would have taken it. Like, they could have offered a stipend to pay their rent for the next 12 months, and they would have taken it. That's the difference between an activist and revolutionary. These folks are not revolutionaries. Let's not conflate them with revolutionaries, and we cannot hold them to the same standard as a revolutionary, but we can with an activist. And that's where I think we have to draw the line at.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I can hear you, brother.
Can you hear me, Torian? Okay. See, because your screen went blank. But anyway, so yeah, thanks for that. But I guess my question would be, it seems like some people just have a bigger PR campaign, or have a bigger
Yep.
they have more sway with the corporate media than others. So you can or you actually you're backed by the corporate media. You have people who are backed by one of the biggest complaints from people in Ferguson was that you have people from the corporate media would listen to them march, or listen to them protest, and they would go on CNN or MSNBC and repeat what they were saying verbatim, and use their talking points on CNN, and act like the talking points were coming from them. So you have that's basically that's a grifter. You have people in the corporate media who do not want to elevate the activists in Ferguson because they want the backlash and they want the exposure. They're the activists. They're the activists because you work MSNBC and CNN and coming off like they're activists. And I'm watching CNN on MSNBC and I'm like, wow, this person repeating the talking points. The whole time I didn't know they were coming from the kids in Ferguson. And so when you don't have your own media, that's a problem. You have black folks in the media working on someone else's platform, and they want to be relevant. And yeah, they may have come to CNN or MSNBC as an operative of the Democratic Party or operative of the Republican Party. But while they're there all the time, now all of a sudden they're activists. They're the activists. They're repeating talking points. They've never marched anywhere. They never put risk life and limb or anything, but they're the activists, and they're making themselves relevant at the expense of other blacks. That's what I was talking about. This meritorious manumission.
Yeah,
you have people listen to what we're saying. People listen to what we're saying too. I've seen people in videos repeating what's not other people on this platform say verbatim. I'm like, wow. So listen to what we're saying. watching what we're saying and pretending that they're us,
Right.
taking on our racial identity, or taking on our persona. So they're watching what real content is saying and repeating it. They know the content is real because it's coming from people who've actually lived these lives, who've done this research, and they're repeating it. And the corporate and the people in the media going, "Wow, Jesus showed us a lot of research." Of course he does. Doing listen to what someone else is saying, and and it's not illegal, and people are doing it, and
Right.
you have the public doesn't really know. The public just goes on with their daily lives, or they're enamored by people when they're
Yeah.
in white spaces. They're enamored by people when they're backed by the corporate media.
Right.
So yeah, they may ask us, "You're so large, how come you're not on CNN?" You know what I'm saying? And so, but to make a long story short, this grifting is not just germane to the conscious community, and not just germane to activists. A lot of people, a lot of African Americans are running around grifting, biting other people's styles instead of elevating real activists and real people with certain disciplines. They have the platform, and we're going to keep the platform, and we'll have to co-opt your message. We will. It's like what a lot of rappers complain about, or or DJs. You hand your mixtape to the DJ at the radio station.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to play
Yeah.
your mixtape because he has his own mixtape.
Right.
The DJ used to play music
Right.
like
You want to
without
be the
the
star.
DJ. Now the DJ wants to be the musician. He wants to be the star because he has the platform. You have people on the radio.
Right.
They don't want to attend the events. They want to host the events. Like they're the celebrities. So is that you have people with platforms, and they're using their platforms to get a bag, and that's it. And um, it's when you do it with and on the backs of grieving mothers, or they do it at the expense of people who are experiencing trauma or some type of police misconduct. That's a different.
No, I
It
mean,
leaves a different taste in your mouth. I think, in my opinion, that's what Samaria Rice is calling out, and uh, when you have people in Ferguson who we never knew, and have pretty much been forgotten, while you have other people running off with this bag, it just makes you feel a certain way, a certain way. For the life of me, I can never figure out why the people in Ferguson were not more celebrated. Apparently, they're not their type of activism or their type of message may not, maybe too direct
no, it's
and
not. I mean, I think
unfiltered,
that there was
and
a
it may
demonization
not be what the
of
corporate media is looking for.
the activism that was in Ferguson and other areas. Yep, Baltimore as well with Freddie Gray
Baltimore too. Didn't I think about it?
murder.
Baltimore too. Didn't I think about
Um,
it?
the
Yeah. Well, on that point, of all the people out in Baltimore with something cogent to say, and about what was going on in Baltimore, why they were protesting, they found a mother who was
yeah,
disciplining her
I
son
remember. Yeah, I
publicly.
remember
That's the
that.
video that went
Yeah,
viral.
that's a whole other conversation. We had a lot of mixed feelings
Right.
there with that, but I remember that video. Um, it's one
Right.
those activities, and one of the things that I quite often keep in mind is what Kwame Ture said. Um, Protest or rioting is the language um, of powerless people. When you continue to push
Mm-hmm.
folks into a corner, and you continue to step on their socioeconomic mobility, there's not, and like I'll give an example, there's over um, 60, 60 towns, 60 towns and cities throughout this country that have, over the last, really since Reconstruction, so over the last 150 years, where Black folks have, quote unquote, pulled themselves up by the bootstrap, as pro-capitalists love to say, that they have started, like all Black towns, whether they had, whole systems of
Mm-hmm.
governance politicians, schools, hospitals. So, we quite often focus on Greenwood, better known as Black Wall Street. But Tulsa was not unique, nor was it the only of its time where we had a complete racial cleansing of an entire community, where folks were simply to themselves and by themselves. Black people have never stormed the Capitol, not once, one time. Have Black people ever stormed DC's Capitol? We can argue anyhow. They've never done that. So in other words, the way that our community has been treated as we are the domestic terrorist, the way that our communities have been treated. So we saw a resurgence of this PR campaign during the riots of the 60s. In other words, after Martin Luther King's death, after his assassination, we see the increase of riots. Even before his death, saw rioting. And so when you look at, folks like Chicago, LA riots, Detroit riots, even within San Francisco, in other words, all of these places where Black people were rioting, it's all, the PR was already done by the state, because the news was already pushing the idea to the rest of the country that what? These people are not only enemies of themselves, that they're enemies of the state. Well, how can you burn down your own community? You're burning down stores and businesses within your own community that are to service you. Well, the problem was that these aren't our communities. That's the issue, is that when you look at the low home ownership rates, that already tells that the low home ownership rates, along with the low business ownership rates, that the communities that we are predominant are not our communities. Hence the rioting response. Hence an affinity to this community, because this community is not serving our community. In fact, it is simply exploiting our community. When we look at what happened to Latasha Harlins. If you remember that in LA, when the Korean woman murdered Latasha Harlins over an orange juice that she never even stole. But the fact that you found that you would a child's head off after she was turned around, her back was turned. She was no longer a threat. Even if you felt physically threatened, her back was to you. This child never had a weapon. She put a bullet hole in this child's head. Life. And what happened to her? She went home to her family. She didn't get to spend the rest of her life in prison. And so when a member of the so-called community can murder a member within that same community cold-blooded, and there is no accountability, tells you that's not our community. That community does not belong to us. Because when we talk about community, not only is there justice, but there is accountability within that community. So the in other words, from a corporate standpoint, the de facto PR has been that this is not an event that you want your corporation to be associated with. So Ferguson and Baltimore and Louisville will never get the corporate response that BLM
all right,
to
fair point.
engage, that D-Ray was able to exploit, that Sean King was able to exploit, simply because these actions are labeled as revolutionary actions. That's the difference. Yeah,
Right. I can't. Yeah, yeah. You're kind of making my point. You can't make my point because Samaria Rice. I don't draw a distinction between Sean King or DeRay McKesson and Samaria Rice. I don't draw a distinction. Samaria Rice, his son was murdered, but maybe the corporate sponsors draw a distinction. Maybe because she sounds more like a revolutionary, and she's giving to you straight. She's not some corporate person. Um,
right.
she's gonna tell you what's on her mind. Michael Brown's parents are going to tell it to you straight. So you kind of making my point that the powers that be in the corporate media make a distinction between these people. When the money, I think the money and the resources and attention should be going to Michael Brown's family and to Samaria Rice, not um, BLM or DeRay McKesson, and
That's
hope
absolutely
it
it.
trickles down because
I
that
mean, when you
obviously
have
is not
to,
trickling down.
when you have to essentially make a
And
public service announcement demanding transparency, BLM, the actual grassroots organizations, the local chapter to collectivize and demand accountability and transparency from the newly minted BLMGN, which kind of came out of nowhere, but was able to raise billions of dollars. And uh, there's no trickle down of funds. That already lets you know what that distinction is. That you don't even support just the daily organizing activities of the local chapters. Uh, so yeah, to me that clearly.
but you mentioned
Yeah,
the
yeah.
situation in LA that happened back in the
Latasha
late
Harlins,
nineties,
yeah.
late eighties, early nineties and I think the public was a lot more
Yeah,
aware back then as well. I think the public's asleep today. You can have someone walking around as
yeah.
activists in Ferguson who never been in Ferguson because the public's not aware. And we don't really have anybody informing us. I mean, unless they're watching Trump and the GE, you're not gonna be informed by watching seeing the corporate media. You're not gonna be informed. You may be entertained. You may have people bickering back and forth and gyrating
Right.
their neck and you know um, waving their finger back and forth, or Van Jones crying in the corner. Um, you may see that. The white lashing of America after Trump gets elected and trying to scare people that kids aren't gonna want to go to school tomorrow because Trump got elected or wake up in the morning. But you had the public is not informed. I spoke at a church in Harlem about a year ago, a couple years ago, maybe a year and a half ago, and we're talking about books and stuff like that. And I'm the only one who owns my own intellectual property, and that's a big thing within the music community. Within music, in that
Yeah.
you have a bunch of rappers, whether it's Young Dolph,
Hmm.
whether it's Yo
Yep.
Gotti, talking about how they own
Yep. Master
their
P.
masters. I think Jay Z owns his masters. I think you have exactly Master P. You have some of the young rappers who actually rap about owning their masters.
Don't forget Ray
Prince is a
Charles
big
was
thing
really the
about
one
that.
that kicked it all
He owns his
off.
masters toward the end of his career, and a lot of right. Well, you also have Curtis
Yeah.
Mayfield and Ray Charles, but Curtis
Hmm.
Mayfield and Sam Cooke. I think it was Sam Cooke, who died under nefarious circumstances because I think he was trying to get
Right.
other people to join his music company, his music label. And then he died under nefarious circumstances. But they were big on owning your intellectual
Yeah.
property. But my point is that the public had no idea who I am, and I have no idea that you're talking about all these authors, and it's business. Who if you decide to sign to a public account, that's your business. That's what you want to do. But a lot of them don't even know the ins and outs of it. That you have a lot of people who are more like uh, a black face on a big
Yeah.
white plantation, or more like a sharecropping arrangement, where you're like almost like a black storefront, shall we say? And so you have the public that's not just the black public is just not informed about a lot of what's going on. So you can have people masquerading as activists who've never even been to Ferguson, never been to Cleveland, didn't know Michael Brown, and we just not aware. The public just not aware of what's really going on. I think that's how a lot of this stuff actually happens, where you have people moving in and out of these events, moving in and out of holding events, and you're having rappers and celebrities show up and talking about Ferguson and talking about Louisville, who have no ties to these places and don't even put local
Right.
activists from Louisville or local activists from Ferguson on the panel. I think that's how that happens, and it shouldn't be
Yeah.
tolerated. But
Now, I think it really,
who's calling it out? And who's calling out? I mean, the fact that someone would even have that notion in their head. We're gonna have Trump and the GE and Richard
now, you know
Ferguson,
what? I think you bring up
everybody from Ferguson.
a really good
I mean,
point
come on.
about,
Yeah, like
I think that there was a level of consciousness in terms of awareness. When we look at that,
level of seriousness too.
that
We seem
is,
unserious now.
that is
We all want to
absolutely
be
true.
entertained. We all want to be
Uh,
entertained.
I'm not sure. I recall I was just having this conversation because there does seem to be a difference in the community response in terms of um, the the accountability. One, I will say that BLM. So to their credit, that has been like there has been no other organization that has got folks to march. I forget who it was that I don't know if it was New York Times or Washington Post that estimated over 100 million people globally um, marched for BLM. So the galvanizing message, we obviously the advent of the internet, specifically social media, has been able to push that. That has largely been a catalyst.
Right.
But in terms of age of social media, I have to, give credit where credit is due. That that's the thing that BLM has executed very well. In other words, getting a level of awareness to folks and giving them action, not just simply watching these injustices and atrocities happen, but the ability to take that emotion that they're feeling at the time, whether it's a righteous anger, whether it's a sadness, but giving them the ability to tap into an actionable engagement that matches what they're feeling at that moment. You know what I mean? So not just reading and not just looking on the news, seeing this injustice, being upset for 15 minutes, but then dissipating after the thought process leads you to the daunting thought of, well, what can I as an individual do about it? And they were able to meet folks through social media and give them something to do with those feelings of watching these injustices happen. They did that very well. And I think that that speaks to why we have this dichotomy, right? Where there's at no other time in history has there been a global march for BLM, 100 million folks that they estimated. But we also are so disconnected from seriousness of whether it's the activism or the revolutionary action, and certainly the efficacy of that. Because think about it, like, because
Now you in terms of how in terms of how you measure it, in terms of how you measure success.
it can't
Success tends
just
to
be the
success tends
fundraising.
to be just
What is the
fundraising, how much money we
efficacy of the
raise.
fundraising other than the check in your pocket? Because when we look at, like, think about that for a moment, even if we cut that in half, and 100 million folks, that's what? a third of the country's population that was calling out, at least supposedly marching, for defunding the police. And who did 80 something million people vote for? The man that specifically said, not only am I not going to defund the police, but I'm actually going to increase their funding by $300 million more. So what was the point of, like, at what point is all this time we have been, I think, socialized to believe? So whether you come from a radical leftist background, whether you come from a more mainstream political background, identify as a Democrat, centrist, or Republican, libertarian. In other words, we have been socialized to believe that once the power of the masses are organized, that's where we will see successes. That's where we will see either reform or a complete dismantling of the status quo. Well, we just had the most organized history of humankind that's been documented, at least 100 million folks. And the impact of that was a president that does not align with those politics. So there's a disconnect there. That evidence is the disconnect. And I think one of the biggest differences between the people that did march, although in smaller formats, even with, the Rodney King verdict, when we had the LA riots, what is the difference between the riots of the early 90s, certainly the 60s? What is the difference between that and the BLM marches that we have of today? Certainly the numbers largely outweigh the today than the 90s and certainly the 60s. Mm-hmm. But what about the efficacy? Because arguably the efficacy of the riots in the 60s led to LBJ finally signing the Civil Rights Act of 19. So like, it was not out of the goodness of his heart simply because JFK was assassinated, or he finally woke up and looked at Martin Luther King and decided he was not the same niggas, or as he called black people with the hard R. Because, say that again.
He called us that.
Oh, 100%, 100%. He was not the lovable president that folks like to push him as. Not at least not for black people, because he couldn't stand black people. He was just as racist as everybody else. So he didn't all of a sudden fall in love with Martin Luther King. Was like, hey, I'm going to give your people more rights than I have to. So in other words, we saw the impact of rioting, which is what led Kwame Ture to saying rioting is the language of the oppressed and the powerless. But I think so. But
BLM was more performative. It was more performative. Yeah, their marches were more performative and aesthetic. But you kind of making my point, because Samaria Rice got results.
That's my point. Samaria Rice, but I don't know what that gap is, and I don't know if it's because when we look at the so somebody in their 20s, for example, during the 90s, if you were say 25 in early 90s. That means that born in the 70s, whether it's mid 70s or the early 70s, you were born in the 70s. Well, why is that important? So it's understanding what was the temperature in the country in the 70s. We're already coming off civil rights movement. We're already at the formation of the Black Panther Party. We're already at the formation of SNCC. We're already at the legacy of Malcolm X. We're already at the legacy of Paul Robeson. In other words, there is a political participation within our community. We have on every side of the spectrum. You still had the Fannie Lou Hamers. You still had folks that were more integrationists. You still had a black socialist movement. You still had black communist movement, such as William Patterson. You still had, so in other words, we had a wide political spectrum and a participation within the politics of this country. So whatever your idea of liberation was, whether it was through a more integrative process, such as CORE and the Civil Rights Movement, or it was a more separatist movement like Republic of New Africa or Garveyite or a Black Panther Party, you had a political home. You had a political representation that was entrenched no matter where you went. So whether it was labor movements, whether it was union movements, in other words, politics was at the core of the participation within society of this country. Since then, I think that there has been a large regression to the political participation. And I think that speaks to the efficacy of where has that political participation led us. Have we seen, like, what is the efficacy of the Black Panther Party movement? In other words, we watch not only Fred Hampton, but 31 other members of the Black Panther Party members murdered. We watched dismantling of the Black Panther Party and Huey Newton, putting on a suit and tie and, getting on talk shows in some senses where in some ways it almost looks like the state has won. We've seen the revolutionaries of the 60s and the 70s, even across the river. So whether you look at the Caribbean, whether you look at Africa, you saw Nkrumah exile, you saw Lumumba assassinated, you saw Sankara assassinated, you saw Amilcar Cabral assassinated. So in other words, no matter whether you look to the continent, whether you look throughout the Caribbean, because you saw Walter Rodney assassinated, you saw Maurice Bishop assassinated, you saw Eric Williams be a complete traitor to the Black Power movement. So in other words, no matter where you stuck your compass as a Black person between, certainly between the 50s and the 80s, you saw the success of the state. You saw the suppression of efforts that were meant to push against the status quo. And I think this is where you see a lot of dismantling of internal organizations, such as the OAU, such as even the Civil Rights Movement, where you see a splintering, in other words. And that splintering are with real people. They have families. They living in the same neighborhoods that they represented. These were the real people. So as they have children, in other words, what is the ideologies that they're passing down? Is it ideologies that, hey, if you organize, if you politically participate, you will push farther than us? Or was a lot of the conversations and a lot of the real material conditions that they were living in? Because that's one of the biggest, I think, drivers to this generation, where they watch their parents raise them in poverty. If you were an organizer and you're holding on to the symbols of organization, so whether you're a Pan-African, whether you were a Black Panther Party member, whether you were a SNCC member, whether you were All African People's Party, Revolutionary Party member. In other words, you may have these symbols. You may still carry the flags, the principles, the pamphlets, the booklets, in other words, of your time period. But other than that, if you struggle to put food into your children's mouths, if every month you struggle to pay the rent, if every time you went out with your children and you had to tell them, don't touch nothing, don't ask me for nothing, don't, like, in other words, your poverty preceded you. The lesson, the biggest lesson that this generation and the generation before them saw was the impact of what that organization effort led to. And to them, in their mind, if they were not taught that poverty is not indicative of success of the organization, then they associate political participation with poverty.
Right.
So what am I going to focus on? I need to change my material conditions, which means what? I need to get to the bag. How I'm going to do that? I need to secure the bag.
Right.
Yep. 100%.
Yeah, I want to be a capitalist. I want to be a capitalist. And these organizations were splintered because the power
That's absolutely
the
it.
African Americans are the agents of change. That's why they focus on blacks. This is agents of change.
Exactly.
They destroyed the Black Panther Party. Lorraine Hansberry, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, James Baldwin. These people spoke truth to power, and they were considered dangerous back then in their time in 50s and 60s. What they were saying was not very popular. They spoke truth to power. And you have people today declaring themselves like Fannie Lou Hamer. I'm like Fannie Lou Hamer. I'm like what's the lady? What's the lady who owned the black newspaper?
I don't know.
From Memphis. The black woman from Memphis, who lived in Memphis, Tennessee. And she was one who protested having to go to the back of the train.
I think she was the original.
Back of the train, I think it was. Back during Reconstruction.
Ida B. Wells. That's right. Oh, yeah.
Ida B. Wells. People compare themselves to Ida B. Wells. People can say, I'm like James Baldwin. Are you really? You speak truth to power? Are you really? Or you clicked up with the Democratic Party? Really? And so the same argument, the same conversation you have, and the same conversation that Betty Shabazz had with Malcolm X. Look at how we're living. Look at other members of the organization living. When Malcolm X was murdered, she had to find a way to make a living. She went back to school. Millie Evers had to find a way to make a living. Martin Luther King's wife had to find a way to make a living. Coretta Scott King. She made sure if anybody used her husband's name or likeness, they got paid. And that's something I'm not sure Martin would have done that, but that's something she did to make sure that her family was taken care of. That's what the Wilds are looking at. All this activism and all this marching and carrying on. That's romantic, but it doesn't put food on the table. And Betty Shabazz, brought that to Malcolm X's attention. That look at our house, and she's looking at the house and the kids and all the work that you've done. How's it benefiting us personally? She asked that question. So I think Gil Scott Heron said the revolution would not be televised. Maybe the revolution has been co-opted. Where now, people are looking at Black Lives. They're looking at, for instance, compare Samaria Rice to maybe Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter. I mean, Samaria Rice is going to get changed.
Right.
She's going to get results. Black Lives Matter is getting a bag. That's what the kids are excited about. They're looking at Jay-Z. They have aspirational. They're aspirational now. They like lives of Jay-Z and Beyonce, the lives of Kanye West. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's what their aspirations are, to get to the bag. And so while you have a lot of black people pushing for change, you have other black people who are going to benefit from that change, but they're not going to go out there and march. They're not going to go out there and march. They're not going to go out there and get sweaty. They're not going to risk anything. So while you bring about change, they're ready to benefit from that change. In terms of, if you want to push for more corporate diversity in corporate America, they'll be happy to take a corporate job. They're not going to push for it. A lot of them, if they are pushing for it, are more like careerists. A lot of people who are pushing for these jobs are kind of like careerists. We need more jobs on Wall Street. We need more jobs in venture capital. So you can go get a job at a venture capital firm and spend your money in white spaces. Participate in white space, but never participate in black spaces, or never become a part of a black ecosystem. So they're more careerists. You look at what's the guy? I think the guy who worked at Citigroup was now running for mayor of New York. Now he's talking at.
That's about Andrew Yang.
I can't think of his name. He's talking at Black Solidarity now. He's running for mayor of New York.
Jermaine Wells?
No, black guy who worked at Citigroup, investment banker.
I don't know then.
They play basketball.
Citigroup.
At
Harvard.
Uh-uh.
Okay, yeah, maybe I'm just drawing a blank on him right now.
I told you his name. You know what I'm talking about. I can't think of his name.
Okay.
But he's running for
When it's
mayor now. But
convenient, because it's socially acceptable. You know
I
what?
mean, these black people. Have you ever? Yeah, exactly. Right. Have you seen them in black
Yep.
neighborhoods? And how are they part of a black ecosystem? You know what I'm saying? You have melanin in your skin, but are you part of a black
Well, I
ecosystem?
mean, I
I mean, are
think too
you
that's
spending your money in black spaces and vice
right.
versa?
No, I think that's too
Are they buying products from you? Are you buying
um,
products from them? And
a part of the problem is that one, there is no black ecosystem. Like Dr. Jared Ball's scholarship. I don't know if you read his latest book, The Myth of Black Buying Power. Uh, I, I highly encourage anybody. You can, I believe, go to his website, Dr. Jared Ball or LL. He's not paying me for this plug, but uh, but you can get his book for. I believe you can still get it for free. I
you
think
should be.
at his
You should
website,
be.
I mix what I like .com. I believe you can still download it at least for free, the electronic version. But he actually he and I connected because I pointed out to him that he and I actually exchanged that idea maybe about a year before his book came out. Because this idea that we have $1 trillion worth of black buying power in the community, and that always sounded weird to me. That just sounded funny to me. I was like, well, how the hell do you get to that number? And my research, as far as I got,
Right.
because I just kind of lazily did it, but I finally got to at least a primary source, which is Nielsen. Where I stopped was where Nielsen got that, corroborated that info from. Dr. Jared Ball takes it significantly farther than I do, but we actually connected on the concept that just on a very back of the envelope math, that when you added up all of the different categories that Nielsen uses, that everyone else was derivative from Nielsen's white paper on this is where that comes from, was Nielsen published a white paper. And then, everybody else took it and ran with it. But they simply took, I believe, 16 categories, identified the value within each, the spending value within each of those categories. And I did the math. I did the actual math. And it came up about 900 and I believe $84 billion short of $1 trillion. I was like, where is this? How are you getting this $1 trillion fee? Like, are you adding a multiplier on this?
Right.
Is this
That's
over,
that's
$1 trillion over 20 years? Like they didn't. Right. It's like, bro, it wasn't even close.
As a
matter of fact, he and I exchanged, had a social media exchange where I reminded him, I was like, hey, do you remember we exchanged before your book came out? He's like, oh my God, yeah, I do remember that. Da, 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 da. But the reason I bring that up is because it speaks to the fact of a black ecosystem. There is no black ecosystem. One doesn't exist. The reason that I even brought up the fact that there are over 60 towns and cities that were built, that black people founded, built literally with their own two hands, were wiped out either by the state or by predominantly white folks in a racial cleansing attempt that's well documented. That speaks to what happens when there is an attempt in this country to build a black ecosystem. That every single attempt has been stamped out. So an accountability, in other words, to your point, where if a black ecosystem existed, then we could have an accountability to benchmark, to say, are you participating within said ecosystem? The issue is that we don't have an ecosystem, ergo why we don't have a true accountability or even yardstick to have the accountability pit against, to say, well, here's where you're failing, here's where you're meeting, and here's where you're succeeding. You know what I mean? Like, we don't have that unit of measurement because the Black ecosystem doesn't exist, and I think that that's intentional.
But it's also a mentality. It's also a mentality too. I mean, well, right, it's intentional because you if you destroy this if you break this mentality, you can kind of break the cycle in future
Correct,
generations as well. Where
but
they
I think it
start
goes
thinking
beyond mentality. I
collectively.
think. Uh, like, I
You
think
get
that because there
punished
is
for thinking collectively.
just having this conversation about uh, essentially individual responsibility and personal accountability versus kind of the conditions that brought you into the need to make such individual decisions. So kind of the macro versus micro argument, right? Um, and it's almost like, well, which was first, the chicken or the egg? But within this instance, we can identify which came first, and it was definitely the chicken. and
Right.
because in this specific instance, where
Right.
our mentality, we can identify dating all the way back to the first slaves long before 1619, the first Spanish conquistadors that brought the first slaves to Florida. And I believe it was like 1509 or 1510, but it was it was a whole century prior to 1619. And the first slaves did what? They waited until they got to shore
Mm.
before slitting the throats of the chickens and building entire maroon towns. The difference, like when you look at the Caribbean, for example, so Jamaica, Barbados, we have kept our maroon towns, like the names of the maroon towns, they still exist. Some of the original descendants,
Mm.
like direct descendants from those maroons, they have an identity within that is recognized by the state. They get certain benefits for being a maroon or descendant of a maroon, in other words. So there is a difference in the way that when you look at the Caribbean and their approach to the liberation, to self-determination, in other words, to that mentality that we shall liberate ourselves out of captivity versus what happened in the US, where every single attempt at self-determined liberation, so whether it was a maroon town or the Gullah Geechee or Black Wall Street or Raleigh Durham or a Farmsville, what ultimately happened to those locations? Those locations are no longer representative of the folks who initially built them, in other words. So after literally, you can literally you can throw a dart at a decade. So this is nothing new. All the way for 400 years, we have made not one, two, three, like you can pick a decade. In every single decade that we have been enslaved, there has been an attempt to liberate ourselves and have a place to call home, so that when folks are liberated, they have a place to go to be able to build a life for themselves. That's happened in every single decade
Mm.
that we have been enslaved. And every single time, what happens to those communities? They are stamped out. Look at the Move organization, 1985, Philly. The only time that the U.S. government drops a bomb.
Yeah, I remember that.
And
I remember that. I remember.
yeah,
I was. I was. I was. I remember. I was eating breakfast. I was about to go to school. I was on my way to school and had the Sheridan Black Network, Black News Network back then.
like who?
They came across the network
Yeah,
that they dropped a bomb on
right.
group.
Like, how do you?
That's my
The
mother.
only group of
How
people
can you drop a
in
bomb
the
on some black
U.S.
folks? And she was like,
Exactly.
I'm sitting there looking like,
Only group of people in the
I'm eating my
U.S.
cereal. I'm sitting there eating my
that
cereal.
have
Like,
a
did I just hear
bomb
what I
drop.
heard? And
So
Wilson
this
Good.
is
And Wilson Good was trying. And Wilson Good was trying to explain it, but I don't think Wilson Good gave the order. I think
Listen,
Wilson Good was trying to explain it. He's the mayor, but the fire department took it upon themselves to do
those
it.
are state
I remember just
representatives.
eating my
The
cereal like, what the hear what I thought?
state, they literally are funded by the state through taxpayer dollars.
Right.
So when you look at yeah,
Right.
when
Exactly.
you look at
Exactly.
state sanctioned
They dropped the bomb
violence,
on Black Wall Street to do it.
every
Right.
single decade, that I think it's just like a grasshopper. You keep capture a grasshopper, you put it in the jar. After a couple of weeks, you can take the top off the jar. Why? Because the grasshopper keeps hitting his head against the top. Because every attempt he's trying to liberate himself, he keeps hitting his head. After a while, even if you take the top off of that jar and there's fresh air coming in, he no longer recognizes that opportunity to liberate. Now his mentality has been conditioned to make a certain set of personal decisions that will ultimately impact the rest of his life. So I think that we do have to recognize, I don't think that it is mentality alone. I think it is the result that we have seen decade after decade after decade after decade as to what ultimately happens when there's an attempt for self-determination, that this nation,
Exactly.
as much as they say pull yourself up by your bootstraps,
Right.
does not support Black self-determination. So I think that just I guess kind of push back on the mentality critique, at least specific to that instance.
No, the point I was trying to make was that once you start breaking these self determination in the adults, at some point
100%. Yeah.
the next generation doesn't have the same mentality anymore as the older generation to be a liberation. That's the problem, because if you break mentally is gone, you don't have people. The concept of Black ecosystem is it's like something that kind of is
Right. Exactly.
foreign to my son, because he didn't really grow up like that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So when I talk about Black ecosystems, like talking about outer space or something. That like I tell the story that my brother and I
Remember
watched
Cisco and Ebert?
Cisco and Ebert back in the day. We thought it was a comedy. We thought it was a comedy.
Yeah.
We watched it and laughed because he would recommend these movies we were never going to.
That was the same.
There
were
never any Black movies. Right? We laughed. We thought it was the funniest thing. We thought it was the funniest thing. These movies, oh my God! He talking about how great it was. I'm like, oh my God! We laughed like they're talking about how great this movie was with only white people in it, and we're laughing to be crying. And the funniest part about it, they never critiqued any Black movies, but they actually critiqued a Black movie and recommended it. It would have been The Kiss of Death, because nobody would want to go see it just because these two bozos who we have nothing in common with recommended it. It would have been The Kiss of Death. Now I think people with my son's generation, Cisco Ebert,
that's interesting.
give a recommendation before going to it. You know what I'm saying? But my generation was like, if they gave a recommendation, if they gave a 2 thumbs up to a Black movie, we crossed it off the list. It's done. It's done. Well, none of the movies we actually went to alike. They're on the list. Like, how come they don't critique Cornbread Earl and Me?
Sucker or Cisco and Ebert.
Anyway. Right. Okay, Torian, we have a certain standard we try to uphold here, Trump and the GE. We can't talk about I'm gonna get you sucker here. I'm sorry. We can't have a certain standard. Cornbread Earl and Me as low as we go, but I'm gonna get you sucker.
I give you Cooley out of here.
That's for CNN or MSNBC. I mean, okay, all right. I'm still crying over Lawrence Hilton Jacob. What? Coach,
oh man,
is he coming back to life, Ma? Is he really dead? Anyway, but so one last
I think I'll just I guess remind folks that while I think critiques are valid, I think critiques are needed to kind of put it in the language of finance as well. Like short sellers are a necessary evil. That the peanut gallery can also be a necessary evil because it does demand a certain transparency and accountability. So even if you don't agree with folks that you deem as detractors, or folks that just sit there and criticize and do nothings, I think one would give Samira Rice credibility to be able to critique is because you cannot call her a do nothing. It's one thing to critique folks from the comfort of your couch,
Right.
and another thing to be in the streets organizing and building with the community and critiquing other folks that are supposed to be building with the community. It's the same, the same respect of why Malcolm respected Martin. Martin respected Malcolm because they both understood that they were both about that life. They may have ideological differences, but they were both in the streets. They were both sacrificing their families' lives, and that no one else that was not making the sacrifices that they were making could ever step to them and garner such a respected response within the critique. So I think that we have to remember that Samira Rice was not only a grieving mother, but she was also spent the majority, to my knowledge, all of her money that she got for the activism, the money that was raised for her son on the community center that she built for her community. So in other words, she put her mouth where her activism was and remains. So I think we will do well to remember that, that criticism that comes from folks that are doing the work should at least be listened to, should be taken with a certain seriousness, but we also must leave room for folks to be critiqued without dashing them out. What's the saying? Throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Again, Tamika Mallory, seems like I don't know her. I've never met her, never had a conversation with her. Really didn't know her beyond, this topic. I've only, seen her name a few times, but it seems like the response is that she is someone that has dedicated her life to organizing for and within her community. But even within the organizing, we can leave room to be critiqued. If our actions are being critiqued, we cannot be above transparency. If we are saying that it is for the community and within the community, one of the things that I appreciate about Brother Kamal Franklin, who's been a long time organizer, Pan-Africanist within the community, especially within New York City, and throughout the country. But if you ask him, where are the funds within the organization, he'll open up the books. Is that level of transparency. And if you're a nonprofit and you're saying that you are for the community and the dollars that you are getting are to represent that community, within it should line up, and you shouldn't have any problem evidencing where those funds are going, who's, cutting those checks, so that the community that you are purporting to represent can see, is your actions in alignment with what you are saying they are. So I don't think that we should ever be above that. I think that should always remain there. And we should also keep in mind that, revolutionaries do activist work, but simply because you are an activist does not make you a revolutionary. So we should not conflate the two, and we should not hold the standards the same as well. Activists can get corporate sponsorships, in my opinion. I believe so. Revolutionaries cannot. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay. So I think the more I think we're gonna see more social unrest, more these uprisings, and you're gonna see more people trying to get to the bag, and that's just the reality of the situation. That you're gonna see people trying to move within these movements and move within these events and try to um, maybe listen, maybe attend meetings, or maybe know some of the participants, and then try to make it go to a corporate media or corporate sponsor to give them the impression that they have some type of viability within the black community, even though locally, whether it's Cleveland or Ferguson or Louisville, nobody in these neighborhoods may even know these people. So I think you're gonna have more of those, and I think it's on a bigger level. It's just people who gonna have a lot of African Americans will continue to grift and continue to tell the book industry or the corporate media or the movie industry that they have some type of viability, and they could be, they could be listening to what we're saying and repeating it, listening to what people in Ferguson are saying in the streets and repeating it. But you're gonna have, and it shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be that way. That what you just said as far as Dr. Jerry Ball and the myth of black buying power. You're basically sort of promoting someone else, and that person ends up promoting you, and vice versa, vice versa. You know what I'm saying? And that and that's how you grow as a community. You don't grow as a community by
Mm.
listening to Dr. Jerry Ball and then repeating it someplace else like it's coming from you,
Yep.
and telling white people that it's coming, or corporate media that it's coming from
Yep.
you, and pretend like you don't know who Dr. Jerry Ball is. You know what I'm saying? I think that's what's going on and within the black community, where people are listening to real activists, following real activists, real economists, real people of substance, and running around with co-opting their message and then taking it to the corporate media or the movie industry or the book industry and saying, look what I did, and sort of making the establishment think that they have some type of viability
Yeah.
within the black community, or taking on someone else's racial identity for a bag. And um, and back in the day, there used to be rules and regulations in the black community. If you broke a rule, there were some consequences. Now seem like there are no
Mm.
consequences, and we actually extol
Yep.
this behavior when people get to the bag. We extol it. We look down on Millie Vanilli back in our day, but today I
Yeah.
think Millie Vanilli would be
Yep.
extolled for playing. They know how to play. They know how to play the game. So I think I look at
Mm.
this sort of grifting across all levels, not just amongst activists, but across within the black community as a total. I think as a whole, and I think it's going to keep occurring, and it's kind of part and parcel of the fake news of people putting out misinformation or misrepresenting, who they are. It shouldn't be allowed. It shouldn't be tolerated. But as long as you have a black community that's not aware of really what's going on, or not trying to figure out the right word, but it's not as aware as they were back in the 50s and 60s. This type of behavior can continue. But anyway, so that's Trump and the GE. Samaria Rice exposes high profile activists. I'd like to thank Mr. Mitchell again for disseminating information to the public as he always does, which is what we do here at Trump and the GE. We're here to disseminate information, and we'll keep doing it as long as you keep listening. So that's Trump and the GE, and I want to thank everybody for listening.
Thanks for having
We'll
me.
be back. We'll be back in
Take
2
care.
weeks. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Mr. Mitchell. So I have to turn off the live stream
Okay.
for the
I gotta wait, right?
so yeah. So we're still on. You can still hear you on YouTube too. So I got to turn it off. One second.
Oh, that's good that you